Please welcome to the stage Vice President of IT and Chief Information Officer of the University of Maryland, Jeff Hollingsworth.
Good morning, everyone. So today, I want to welcome you to the session on creativity and artistry in high-performance computing. For many of us who've worked in the field for years, creativity meant that new CFD algorithm. Artistry often means that beautifully cabled rack we see in the data center. But today we're going to take and look at the ideas of creativity and artistry and expand them to what broader society might mean and think of those terms and see how the wonderful and incredible technology of high-performance computing is expanding the fields of creativity and artistry. To do that, we have two wonderful talks. Our first speaker today is Varshney, who is the Della Pietra Infinity Professor and inaugural Director of the AI Innovation Institute at the Stony Brook University. He's also co-founder and CEO of Kocree, Inc., a startup using novel, human-controllable AI for discovery and creativity. He is also the chief scientist of Ansaris, Inc., a startup company focused on AI and wastewater treatment. His research interests include information theory and artificial intelligence. He received his bachelor degree from Cornell and his MS and PhD degrees from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Please welcome Love to the stage.
Great, thanks for having me. This is my first time at supercomputing, so I'm excited to be here. What I want to talk about is creativity, which most people think of as the pinnacle of human achievement, kind of the special sauce of what makes us who we are as people. And it's kind of interesting to ask, where does computational creativity or AI-driven creativity fit into this? Over the last several years, many of us have been using LLMs in various forms. And one might wonder, are those actually helping us be more creative, or are they kind of taking away our creative control? And so there's a lot of questions there. And I titled my talk as High Performance Creativity, HPC, to also try to raise questions of how high-performance computing might contribute to developing systems that can improve human creativity and perhaps lower the bar to human creativity, but really help everyone kind of flourish with their creativity. And this is a field that I've been working in for quite a while. So I was a researcher at IBM just after my PhD, and I started and led the Chef Watson project, which was for culinary creativity, and I'll describe that a little bit. This was back in 2011, 2012, and arguably it was the first commercially successful generative AI technology at the time, or creative AI technology. Had between $100 million and $1 billion of impact for IBM right in the first couple of years. So, kind of an initial foray. And since my return to academia and working in government and so on, I've continued working in creativity, and I'm going to try to show you some of those ideas. I'm an information theorist by training, and so Claude Shannon is kind of my intellectual hero. And he wasn't very big on kind of self-reflection. He wrote his papers and went home and juggled and did his thing. But one time he actually gave a talk on creative thinking, and he gave kind of these tricks for formulating or solving problems. And his 6 tricks were: first, simplification, getting rid of enough detail, including some of the practical aspects for intuitive understanding. Secondly was similarity to a known problem, and here experience seems to help in understanding those similarities. Third was to reformulate, avoid getting in a rut. Fourth was to generalize, and this is different than simplification. It's kind of casting things in a more abstract sense. Fifth was structural analysis, breaking problems down into pieces. And in fact, nearly all creativity can be thought of as decomposing into pieces and recomposing into new combinations. And finally, inversion, working back from the desired result. And one might wonder, how many of these things are computable, right? Can you simplify using AI? Can you generalize? Can you do structural analysis? And this is actually a really great way to think about creativity research is, can you develop kind of this toolbox of techniques that are helpful for people to kind of get more and more creative? As I was mentioning, nearly all creativity is combinational. As Arthur Koestler described, creation doesn't appear from thin air, but is an act where already existing things or ideas are selected and combined or shuffled in a new way. The great kind of cognitive scientist and computer scientist of creativity, Margaret Bowden, kind of described that combinational creativity produces these unfamiliar combinations of familiar ideas. And it works by making associations between ideas that were previously only indirectly linked. And this is true even for the most high level of what she calls H creativity, historical creativity, not just P creativity that's personally creative for you, but creative for everyone. And there's very few examples of what she calls transformational creativity, where it's a completely new representation and a completely new way of thinking about things. Copernicus is often used as an example of this in moving from a geocentric to a heliocentric view of the world. Or of the universe. There was a shift in representation which was not combinational or combinatorial. But nearly every other idea you can think of historically can be thought of in these ways. And so, so how should we put pieces together? And so let me start with culinary, where we have ingredients and we want to create novel and flavorful recipes, let's say. Right? So, this is an example of a Kenyan Brussels sprouts gratin. It has dried cherries, it has almonds, Brussels sprouts, of course, sweet potatoes, and so on. And this is a dish that we made for my mother, my late mother. She was not a big fan of Brussels sprouts. So we took on this challenge. How can we make a dish with the Chef Watson system that she would like? And so we used a variety of techniques that drew on a lot of knowledge bases. So the hedonic psychophysics of human flavor perception, the chemical composition of foods, a lot of culinary sources, large corpora of recipes, and so on, cultural knowledge like regional cuisines. And we didn't fully get to personalization back, this was 13 years ago, but she actually liked this a lot. So it was kind of an interesting example where you might ask, how did we put the pieces together? How do you know which ingredients go well together, which ones will lead to kind of nice combinations? And so that's where a lot of the technology development was focused. And we took this forward. So my wife and I actually served this recipe, this Caymanian plantain dessert at our wedding reception. It was also in Wired magazine and various other things, but this one had a banana cream layer, it had a cayenne pepper and a citrus layer, plantain chips, and so on. And so this was, again, kind of a nice example where we were able to, our wedding was in Florida, and our chef was actually from the Cayman Islands, so he actually really liked this. We worked with Chef James Risquione, who's depicted in the New York Times article, and so on. And doing these kinds of simple demonstrations is nice, but how do you actually industrialize something like this, right? Cooking in my mother's kitchen or at our wedding reception is one thing, but how do you take it out into the world? And so this is where kind of the big questions arose. So, we did a cookbook, we did a food truck, but then we also did these partnerships with public-facing large multinational food companies. Right? So one was Bare Naked Granola. And so here it was that users themselves could design new granola combinations. And then Bare Naked Granola would make it and then send it to you. On the other hand, someone like McCormick, the spice company, they actually used the technology internally in their R&D processes to develop things like the one skillet spice mixes that you can still buy in grocery stores, actually, even 10 years later. And these are kind of two interesting examples of creativity. One is empowering users to create their own things. The other is empowering enterprises to accelerate their product design cycles. And there's some kind of interesting differences between them. In one, you really care about lowering the bar to creativity for the average user. You want to suggest, granola combinations that will likely work well together, rather than things that are hard, that probably will taste bad. On the other, you want to be in this high performance mode, right? So you want to actually generate ideas quickly that will be good and kind of go through the whole industrial process. And it suggests novel questions in creativity itself that you might not think of if you're focusing on kind of that P creativity, that personal creativity, rather than this kind of large-scale creativity. The technology, I think it's still under NDAs, and so I won't describe all the different multinational food companies that use the Chef Watson technology internally, but it's quite a bit. A lot of things you can buy in grocery stores today are actually developed using the technology. Okay. James and I, so James is a world-class chef. He's beaten Bobby Flay and won Chopped and all kinds of things. So he and I are talking again about seeing how can we draw on modern AI technologies, LLMs, and various other things to not just have flavorful foods, but healthy and sustainable foods as well. And so we're building this technology right now called culinary AI, where we're aiming for ease, cost, flavor, variety, and trust. And then we're also drawing on the supply chain of food to actually make the food system more resilient from the consumer perspective. And so again, we're pretty excited about this, that you can actually take, say, ICD-10 codes, like, I have diabetes and I have this and I have that, and I like Indian food and I want it to be done in 15 minutes and actually generate recipes that one can execute. And this can have pretty big impacts on public health and on kind of food resilience quite broadly. So we're excited to be pushing that forward. And as I mentioned, one of the core aspects of this is really drawing on knowledge. So as we've done our trials, using just straight LLMs, if you have them generate recipes, they might read well, but when you start cooking them, it doesn't often work out. And so you really do need to draw on domain knowledge. And I think that's one of the areas where creativity research can really benefit from kind of the knowledge engineering and various other things that have been developed across information sciences and computer sciences. Just to give an example, the flavor network that YYon and Sebastian Anert developed back in 2011, and that we actually drew on for Chef Watson, or like the spice, herbs and spice network that we just developed to understand their health impacts. These are examples of kind of knowledge sources that one can draw on to kind of do these kinds of health and sustainability-driven creativity. All right, let me take a second example, which is sustainable building materials. So concrete is the most prominent building material in the world, and 8% of global carbon emissions are due to cement production. Just as a comparison point, aviation, all of aviation is only 3% of carbon emissions globally. Okay? So you might wonder, people have been doing concrete for thousands of years, right, since the Romans or even before. Like, how could you innovate on that, right? And so what we did was we trained a very small AI model, trained on just 1,000 examples of concrete. And it was a simple, conditional variational autoencoder. And we used this to generate novel formulations of concrete. And what we were able to do is actually have half the embodied carbon as traditional concrete, and also much stronger. And so we worked with our colleague in civil engineering to make the cylinders and crush them to make sure their compressive strength was appropriate. And one point to note is if you look at the figure on the right, the one with the arrow, that's a new formulation. The others are the training data. And so what you can see is, there is this extrapolative capability. And moreover, there's much less cement and a greater use of other cementitious materials. And that's what really drives down the carbon requirements. And once we had this kind of basic approach worked out, we worked with Meta. They were building a new data center in DeKalb, Illinois. It's a kind of $1 billion plus project. And they actually used our concrete as part of their construction. And now they've built a second data center in Rosemont, Minnesota that also uses our concrete. You know, as this audience knows, there's a big push to decrease the carbon and energy requirements of data centers. This is in the physical building itself, and it actually can be a huge impact. Just like it's fun to eat your own food, it's also fun to go walk on your own concrete. And interestingly, Meta has been pushing this even further. And so now there's been a commitment from the Open Compute Project Foundation, which is a consortium of AI hyperscalers. So it includes numerous companies, many of whom are here, to use our AI approach for concrete in numerous data centers. And there's also now a partnership with Holcim, which is arguably the largest cement and concrete manufacturer in the world, to further optimize and deploy AI to concrete, not just for data centers, but all kinds of other applications. Right? So perhaps this will be the most impactful thing I've ever done, right? You know, reducing carbon emissions by 4% with a very, very small AI model, but getting it out there. You can do the same kinds of things with creativity and engineering design, not just materials design. So at NSERIS, we've actually designed novel wastewater treatment processes that have 30% less energy requirements and so on. As I was mentioning, I served in government for a year on the National Security Council staff at the White House. And there's always this discussion in those circles of how to be creative, how to design policies in a creative way. And one can even think about creativity, computational creativity for policy design. So things like taxation or food supply resilience or nuclear nonproliferation or securing the information environment. Any of these problems, you can actually do kind of a neat reinforcement learning simulation-based approach to design. Okay? So, so there's all kinds of possibilities for creativity, and in particular, computational creativity. And so what I want to now switch gears to is ask, you know, I argued that you want to have combinational or combinatorial creativity, right? And one might wonder, you know, where do I get the parts? Where do I get the combining rules? And so what I'm going to tell you next is about a technique that's called information lattice learning that we developed in my group. And it allows you to do that kind of decomposition and recomposition. As part of that, you actually learn the laws of a domain. This is Claude Shannon when he was a kid. So he used to play the alto horn and was, you know, big into music. So I'm going to use music as a running example, but the technology is actually quite general. Right? So, so let's get into it. And this information lattice learning, it actually goes back to Shannon's lattice theory of information that he developed in 1950. Many of you have heard of his 1948 paper where he introduced information theory, which was about how much information is there, you know, measured in bits and so on. But this very obscure work, the lattice theory, was you know, just 2 years later, and it was asking what is the true nature of information, asking you know, if I say something in English or I say it in French or in Morse code and they're valid translations of each other, it seems like I'm conveying the same information. And so what he argued was that there's an equivalence class of informationally equivalent random variables that have the same sigma algebra. And that very simple idea actually leads to a huge amount of mathematical machinery. So you get partition lattices, you get subgroup lattices, you get all kinds of things that have not been thought about in machine learning, but now that we're doing it, it actually provides a very powerful approach to AI creativity. And in particular, Shannon himself believed that the promising new developments in information theory would come from complex machines, especially research into artificial intelligence. Some people think, you know, he wasted the later part of his life on, you know, maze playing mice and juggling, and I mean, like all kinds of things. But in fact, I would argue those were experiments in AI. In fact, this maze with the mouse was the first instance of reinforcement learning, as anyone can tell. Right? And so on. Okay, so what I'm going to show you is kind of an automatic music theorist. So what we want to do first is learn the laws of music theory. So we want to take a small amount of data, say 370 chorales by Johann Sebastian Bach, and get kind of the laws of music theory. And then we want to use those laws to do creativity. And the reason we're going with this intermediary is to be able to do decomposition and then recomposition, rather than end-to-end like some of the music gen AIs you might have seen, like Suno or Udio. There, the creative control doesn't rest so much with the humans. Here, the creative control and authenticity is very much with people. Okay. And so the basic idea is we want to learn a human interpretable concept hierarchy, not just individual rules. And so just like humans, when we learn, say, music, we learn about notes, and then we learn about things like scales, and then from scales we learn about chords, and so on and so on. We don't learn about complicated things like chord progressions in terms of raw notes anymore. We use the intermediate knowledge to learn more complicated things. And so we want to do the same thing here as well. And in particular, information lattice learning is intrinsically interpretable. So if you think about Fourier analysis, you decompose signals in Hilbert space by projecting them onto these frequency components. But at least for me, frequency components aren't the most natural things. In sound, maybe a little bit, but beyond that, I have very difficulty in understanding like the frequency components of images and phases of images and things like that. On the other hand, the lattice decomposition is naturally hierarchical, and moreover, each of the nodes corresponds to a subgroup. And so the subgroup invariance, the symmetry, is the explanation for that projection. And the rules are those descriptions. So, soprano is higher than alto, could be a permutation group-based symmetry, things like that. Right, so, and the goal is to have self-exploration. So you want to learn domain knowledge from essentially universal priors that encode no particular prior knowledge. And this is why there's a group theoretic foundation and this generalization of Shannon's information lattice. And also you want to be self-explanatory. So the whole learning process should be transparent to people, as well as the result, with a particular mechanistic cause, this symmetry. And so that's what we're able to achieve. Okay? And unlike, say, big neural networks, there is phase one. So when you use neural networks to do learning, you just kind of give it data and you use a huge amount of data, and then you learn what you learn. Here, there's this phase one where we actually construct the abstraction universe, the set of what is possible to learn. And this requires solving a fairly complicated computational group theory problem. So explicitly constructing partition lattices or subgroup lattices, as the case may be. And because you've spent that computational effort in structuring what is possible to learn, the learning itself with data, phase two, actually becomes much more simple. It becomes very simple computationally. It becomes also very data efficient. Like I was describing, you can literally use 370 chorales by Bach to learn huge amounts of music theory. Or I'll show you some examples in Vision. You can have literally like 4 examples of each digit in MNIST rather than 6,000 like most people use, and get 90% accuracy. So literally 40 examples is enough. And then once you have the rules, then you can use those as knowledge discovery for scientific domains as well as cultural ones, or even idiosyncratic ones in say, national security. But also use that information lattice space as a representation to then do downstream tasks like classification or compression, and of course, creativity, like we're aiming for. Okay. In case you're curious, the construction of partition lattices, the pseudocode is not very long, but it is fairly intense computationally. So if anyone wants to talk to me about how to implement this efficiently, if anyone has some HPC techniques for this, I'd be appreciative if you can talk to me about this. Right? The high-level ideas are in this SciAm journal on applied algebra and geometry paper. Okay, so the intuition of information lattices is as follows. Right, so suppose I have a bunch of shapes, and I want to induce like knowledge or concepts from it by partitioning things into sets, into subsets. Does anyone have any thoughts on what one might be able to do? Yeah, I know this is not the best format for interactive, but feel free to shout it out. Yeah, so color, concavity, and then number of sides. Yeah, exactly. So those are things that you can see directly by partitioning. And so that induces these ideas like red and blue, or convex concave, or trigon, tetragon, pentagon. right? And so you can actually discover all kinds of concepts just by trying to figure out what are the appropriate partitionings. And moreover, there's a natural refinement and coarsening structure. And so that's where the lattice actually comes from. So you can take red things and trigon things and get red trigons or blue pentagons and so on. And that's where the lattice structure actually comes from. Right? And so this is exactly what we do in a bigger sense when we construct partition lattices. So what are the possible things that one can learn? Okay? And then when one does that, one can actually take data and learn laws for a given domain. To do the learning, as I was mentioning, there's this equivalence to Shannon's lattice theory of information. But Shannon actually assumed the probability measure was known. On the other hand, what we do is we just have the structure first, and then we use data to learn the probability measure. So it becomes a machine learning way of thinking about things. Okay, to actually do the learning, we have a student-teacher-like architecture. It's a little bit like a GAN, a generative adversarial network, except the student and teacher are actually helping each other. They're not adversarial. And so the basic idea is a student starts with an empty rule set, let's say, and tries to be as random as possible, like on a piano keyboard, just randomly playing notes. And sends that composition, that probability distribution, to the teacher. The teacher has a training corpus and compares the two, listens to this composition and says, how do I push the student to be as close to Bach as possible? What's the most discriminative rule? That's added to the rule set, and now the student is constrained by the first rule, is as random as possible, maximizes entropy under the first rule, passes that to the teacher maximizes a Kullback-Leibler divergence, finds this second most discriminative rule, and so on, and you keep iterating this, and you actually end up with this class of rules that are pushing you as close to the training corpus as possible. And you can go ahead and do this, and it's actually quite effective. You might wonder, how is this human interpretable? So you get these kind of histograms corresponding to set partitions and the induced probability distributions. But you can convert those to words quite easily. So if you take the first histogram, you'll notice the probability mass is concentrated on C, D, E, F, G, A, and B, and not on the others. And that's what's called a diatonic scale in music. But a more complicated rule later in the hierarchy would be something on the bottom. And you'll notice the axis is not labeled by raw notes anymore. It's labeled by other things. And so that's an example of a more complicated rule. And that's kind of demonstrates this point that you build more complicated knowledge from simpler knowledge, not from raw data anymore. And what we did was we had first-year freshman music theory students take histograms and convert them into words. And they did reasonably well. So 3 students got a perfect score on their homework assignment, 7 scored between a 40 and 50, and so on. 5 students didn't do the homework, but that's the bane of all of us professors. Right, so this demonstrates that it is quite naturally interpretable. And this was freshman music theorist students. If you have professionals do it, I mean, it's trivial for them. Cool. And so you might wonder, how much do I recover? So I recover actually nearly all of known music theory. If you look at a standard curriculum, there's roughly 75 topics that are taught. And so 45 are directly recovered. 7 are impossible to recover given the nature of the data. And 18, we know exactly why we missed them because of certain computational constraints. And so it's really 5 out of 68 that we're pretty unclear about. Okay. So again, it's quite compelling. You're able to discover knowledge that took hundreds of years to formalize using a fairly small amount of data. And you can actually discover new music theory as well. So for example, if you'll notice the second example, so as you notice, there's this underline of the second difference of pitch. The acceleration of pitch. And this is something that music theorists have never described before, but we talk to our music theorist friends and they find it actually quite compelling, among other more complicated findings. Right? And so now what you can do is actually use this for creativity. And so I won't do demos because it's hard to do it on stage, but This platform, if anyone's interested, I can give you access. This is through the startup company Kocree. And what you can do is you can take existing music, for example, and decompose it into abstract pieces of rhythm, harmony, and melody. We call these pieces muons. And then you can compose with those muons. So, I can take, say, the harmony from Happy Birthday and the rhythm from Mozart's Piano Sonata K545 and the melody from the Beatles' Hey Jude, and combine those together into a new composition. And this kind of higher level programming language for music, let's say, it kind of lowers the bar to creativity. And moreover, the foundation lattice is trained literally on the 370 chorales by Bach, which have been public domain for hundreds of years. And then each of the muons, as we call them, these abstract pieces, those are fully traceable and attributable and therefore monetizable. And so it allows everyone to monetize their creativity rather than having it be scraped and stolen and exploited. So a lot of my friends that work in the hip-hop ecosystem in the Midwest, we've had long-standing conversations about this, and it's a way for communities to really grow their cultural wealth rather than getting exploited by initially record labels and now by some of the big Gen AI companies. You might wonder, does this work for other things? In fact, you can, for example, learn the laws of neurogenesis. So you can take single-cell RNA sequencing data that govern pattern formation and neurodevelopment and actually learn kind of a more refined version of gene regulatory networks. And again, you can combine these into new things. And just to give you an example of say, vision, this is a fairly difficult task for humans, or for anyone actually. You're supposed to classify these hand-drawn samples. So is this a giraffe, or is this a fork, or is this a hamburger, right? And humans perform just under 40% accuracy. And if you look at, say, the vision transformer, which is state-of-the-art visual technology, that's only at 25.9%. But using the information lattice approach can get you to nearly human-level performance, quite a big jump over vision transformers. Right? And so we're excited about this information lattice approach for knowledge discovery, for creativity, for classification. And in fact, some of the things we're working on now are in areas like super Yang-Mills theory in particle physics and quantum optics and materials discovery, where the goal is to be creative in developing novel experiments or materials and so on. Okay. So this is really great. We have kind of these sets of algorithmic approaches for creativity, whether it's information lattices or the very conditional variational autoencoders for concrete, or kind of a fairly bespoke thing that we did for Chef Watson. But I think everyone's been thinking about this question: what about LLMs? So are they creative? It's a good question, right? So just to take an example like Claude. I mean, I'm taking it because it's named after Claude Shannon, but this would be true for any of the LLMs. There's this vision that it assists and collaborates, but eventually, like by 2027, for example, the claim is they should be able to create completely new things that are pioneering, as they say. And so one might wonder, is this something that is possible or not? And I've been thinking about transformers and LLMs for quite a while myself. We actually built the first billion parameter plus LLM back in 2019. The first open weight released billion parameter plus model. It was better than GPT-2 at the time and so on. It was fairly fluent in creating text. It was factual largely and so on. And something new, just from a couple of weeks ago with our colleagues at the University of Michigan and around the country, we've recently built this foundation model for discovery and exploration in chemical space. Tying back actually to Chef Watson, this model is actually very good at predicting the olfactory percept of odor compounds. And as you may know, about 85% of flavor is odor. It's also really great for discovering new electrolytes for batteries and so on. Right? So, there's LLMs seem to be really powerful for a variety of things, whether it's language or chemistry or or all kinds of stuff. But still not sure, are they creative in the sense that Bowden would recognize as creativity? And also, one might wonder, if I keep making these things bigger, will they continue to get better? So on kind of more standard notions of performance, there's been these observations of scaling laws. There's the so-called chinchilla scaling law that if you increase the data size together with the model size in a linear fashion, that's actually a good thing. We were actually able to prove this information theoretically optimal, the optimality of it. So the chinchilla scaling law is actually optimal. Moreover, there is a true phase transition. So the information theoretic argument shows that as you increase size, there is literally a phase transition and this emergence. And moreover, that there's plateauing. But in fact, there can be multiple plateaus and multiple emergences. And so it's quite possible that this empirical plateauing that we're seeing is not this last plateau, but it might be the first or the second. And so it's quite possible there's this more juice left in the hyperscaling paradigm. Okay. Further, there's been a lot of interest in inference compute scaling. And so as we showed in this paper that'll appear in the Transactions of the Royal Society soon, that if you consider both the compute for inference together with the compute for training, you actually want to have sub-chinchilla scaling, and that's actually optimal. And I mean, there's a lot of kind of detailed mathematical work behind that. But what we want to ask to close this discussion today is about creativity of LLMs. So we've just done this paper. It's on arXiv. It was posted in September, asking, is there a scaling behavior for creativity of LLMs? And we discovered that, in fact, we can characterize that scaling. Secondly, we discovered that for a fixed compute budget, there exists optimal model depths and widths for creative ability. But the thing that we find especially intriguing, but maybe troubling, is that there's a so-called ideation execution gap that's been recognized empirically with LLM creativity in domains like science. That LLMs can generate novel things, but they struggle to ensure their practical feasibility. We saw that also in the culinary setting, like I was describing. The recipe might read well, but when you try to execute it, it just doesn't bake or it doesn't execute. And in particular, this is due to a more fundamental novelty-utility trade-off in creativity algorithms. And this persists even at scale. Like even as you go to scaling things, there's this ideation execution gap. And so it really casts doubt on the long-term creative potential of LLMs, at least the way they're currently constructed. Right? So there's kind of a need for a broader class of algorithms, the information lattices, reinforcement learning, new things, cognitive architectures that haven't been developed yet, and so on. And in fact, this novelty-utility trade-off is actually fundamental, but that is something that no matter how clever the engineer is, we cannot overcome. And so I just wanted to describe that briefly. As engineers in this audience, what every engineer needs is a good set of limit theorems. And why? It's to establish what resources and performance criteria are fundamental and which are largely unimportant. These limit theorems, like Shannon's for communication, demarcate what's possible from what's impossible and also provide design insights into operating at that boundary. They define fundamental benchmarks to evaluate new engineering designs on an absolute scale rather than comparatively. And this is something that I think the computing industry would actually benefit from quite considerably. Right now, it's always, I'm 10x better than the previous guy. It would be nice to know what is the ultimate limit that no one, no matter how clever they are, can get beyond and kind of try to achieve those. And so one can go through a formalism for creativity. I won't go through the details, but there's some mathematical work to be done in mathematizing creativity. But what one ends up with is a fundamental tension between novelty and quality. And in fact, it's related to communication in various ways. But what the payoff is that you can actually describe optimal creativity algorithms coming out of the mathematical theory. So it's a kind of an optimal stochastic sampling algorithm where you have ideas and then a selection phase to select the best one. And this is something that one can actually start to think about implementing. Again, analogously to communications, where information theory describes optimal codes, and then it took 50 years or 60 years to find implementable codes that achieve the Shannon limit. Likewise here, this is a description, and then there's some work to be done to find those optimal implementable algorithms. Okay, so what I've tried to do today is to tell you a little bit about creativity, and that there's a lot of emerging approaches, some that are fairly computationally heavy, some that can be data light and computationally efficient. And there's kind of a huge possibility for expanding the space of what humans can achieve. You can try to help people develop things that they've never imagined before, reach that pinnacle of human achievement that I described. And I think this is especially important in a setting where we're starting to see that science and creativity are not an endless frontier like Vannevar Bush described, but in fact, there are fundamental limits to it, like Shannon described. This is a publicity photo from Bush's lab. So he's, of course, the person on the left, but the one that just made the photo, the one on the extreme right, that's actually Claude Shannon when he was an early grad student. And so I want to challenge this audience to think about creativity as a compelling domain in which to think about high-performance computing, developing efficient algorithms, and really uplifting people to their full potential. Right, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, so we have some time for questions. If you're joining us remotely or feeling shy, feel free to use the application. Otherwise, please come up. We have mics available. Oh, someone coming up in the center?
So along the lines of imposing limitations, what do you think are the most important ones right now?
Like limitations on what? You mean?
So in context of HPC, do you think the limitation should be software? Should it be hardware? Should it be the human?
Oh, yeah. So as we're building, so there's two parts to kind of implicit in your question, right? So there's the creativity of building novel HPC systems. And so there, again, there's this question of parts and combining rules. And so that, I think, is still very open. A lot of people talk about cross-layer design, integrating software and hardware, thinking about human interaction and a variety of things. How to do that, like what is the appropriate decomposition and recomposition, I think is still very much open in the HPC setting. Moreover, the fundamental limits of what is possible with HPC, I think, is also unclear. So if you have basic resources like energy and area and silicon or whatever stuff, right? So there's some material resource and the capabilities. What is the fundamental relationship between the two? I think that is still unclear. So that's on the creativity for HPC side. There's also the what can HPC contribute to creativity development part of your question. And so there, again, I think there's these neural network-based approaches to creativity. There's information lattice approaches. There's all kinds of other algorithmic approaches that have been developed. And there's, of course, been a huge amount of effort on making LLMs efficient, but not for that other set of creativity algorithms. And so there, I think there's a lot of potential. The computational group theory problem I described is a particular case of strong interest to me, because creating larger and larger lattices allows a much more expressive kind of creativity and scientific discovery.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Is discovery creativity? What's the difference between like discovery and creativity? And also, is discovery becoming more combinatorial, given how LLMs are trained and how that's just given that, I guess?
Yeah. So So there can be kind of explicit combinatorial things, like with food ingredients. It's literally, flour and jelly and whale meat and saffron, right? I mean, it's literally explicitly combinatorial. On the other hand, neural networks are very implicitly combinatorial. In fact, there's kind of this compositional description of them that's been developed over the last several years. To your question, so what is the difference between discovery and creativity? And so I think there's some kind of confusion oftentimes in the words we use. So like, for example, materials discovery is typically a creativity problem. It is like, take metal alloys. It's about how do you take elements and put them together in combinations. It's not like you're discovering new elements typically. The periodic table is what it is, roughly speaking. I mean, every 50 years you get a new element or something, but roughly speaking, it is what it is. And so, for a lot of domains that people think about as discovery, like materials discovery, it is really a combinational creativity problem. And whether LLMs are pushing people to operate in those modes more, I think that is quite possible. I think there is kind of this epistemic blind spot that's emerging. So where the LLM light shines, people are working much more in scientific research, and where it doesn't shine, they're kind of not pursuing those questions. And so this kind of lacuna of scientific discovery and cultural creativity as influenced by certain AI technologies is perhaps troubling. And that's why I always like to think of developing creativity technologies where the human still maintains authenticity and creative control. That's really been a lot of our motivation.
Thanks. I think we're just about out of time here, so let's stop and thank Love again for his insightful comments and interesting journey through food, concrete, and a whole bunch of other ways that we've been looking at creativity and HPC. Thanks. Okay. All right, so we will now move on to our second speaker in this session. Dieter Offenhuber is a professor and chair of Art plus Design Department at Northeastern University in Boston, where he also directs the Semantic Matter Lab. His research investigates the material dimensions of data, focusing on practices in evidence-making, visualizations, and governance and contested social environments. Trained as an architect, urban planner, and technologist, he integrates experimental, artistic, and design-based methods into non-artistic research contexts, broadening the methodological repertoire available for socially engaged scholarships. Please welcome him to the stage.
Yeah, welcome. Thank you very much for this invitation and for this kind introduction. I guess I'll provide a little bit of an outsider perspective, even though my engagement with high-performance computing goes back to the 90s when I worked in cave environments with SGI machines, if this still means anything. But since then, I've steadily moved into a more analog realm, as you will see. But I think what connects us is that you guys are experts in all kinds of weird data sets that challenge the common understanding and assumptions about this term, which is something that greatly excites me. So let me briefly start here. What do I mean by non-referential data? Let me give a brief overview of how we traditionally think about data from a representational perspective. So we have things in the world that are measured and encoded into data. The data set then represents these things, so data point to the things and substitute them. So we assume a stable relationship between the things of the world and data. And because of that, the connection between things and data tends to fade into the background. The objects become less important. And data, of course, also then creates their own reality. It can be aggregated, visualized, transformed, and shared. Scholars in the humanities will point out that measurement is, of course, never neutral or unbiased. And my choice here is not accidental. The IRIS dataset by Ronald Fisher, one of the founders of modern statistics, is the Hello World example in every introductory machine learning course. A dataset comes from a 1936 paper in which he introduced linear discriminant analysis, LDA. This was historically significant because Fisher brought quantitative modeling to biology, which was at that point mostly a qualitative field. And the paper, as you see in the bibliographic note at the bottom, was published in the Annals of Eugenics, and Fisher had a strong commitment to eugenics. He wanted to introduce a scientific rigor to it. So the same methods for classifying flowers were meant to be used to establish the differences between people and use it to inform a particular flavor of social policy that I guess sounds horrifying for us today. This is important to consider, but it's not what I'm going to talk about. The example allows me to discuss some of these common assumptions about data. First is that data are symbolic, so there's some kind of conventional mapping between things in the world and data objects. Data are representational, meaning that there is a connection to things in the world, but things here could also mean concepts, abstract objects. And third, that data are computational, that their purpose is to inform and enable computation. So these are typical common assumptions, but all of them have been challenged in philosophy and history of science. At best, they are very incomplete, so there are a lot of books about the role of representation in scientific practice, for example. So in the following, I will talk about some forms of data that we encounter that violate all three assumptions. And the first is what I call autographic data. Autographic means self-inscribing, so data resulting from self-inscribing processes. Some time ago, I noticed a really interesting phenomenon that grassroots scientists, environmental activists, amateur forensic experts are increasingly using a very analog way to visualize information. And for me, this was a bit surprising because there was this huge push over the last 10 years in the field that was about like increasing data literacy and introducing data analytics and data visualization methods. So it was interesting to see that this kind of move towards the analog. This example involves pedestrian and bicycle advocates that go out after snowstorms to document the areas where cars don't go, to indicate areas that could be reclaimed for pedestrian space. And this is what they call snack downs. It's a kind of a nod to some urban planning terminology. But you see, they take these photos, annotate them, share them on social media with the argument that, these traces shows that cars would need much less space on the road if the drivers drove as carefully as they do after a snowstorm. And this is quite successful as a movement. Many cities, Philadelphia, Chicago, Somerville, Boston, have acted on these and used them as a starting point for traffic calming efforts. So for me, the interesting point here is that the data that they are using are physical traces, not symbolic encodings, literally the snow that is touched or not touched by vehicles. So autographic data challenges the representational assumption, of course, because we refer to traces and the traces tell us something about reality, but in themselves, the traces don't represent anything. They just present themselves to us. But more specifically, this framing challenges the symbolic assumption, so that data are not always abstract symbols, but they are always tangible and they are always physical. And even if we talk about bits on a hard drive, they are physical things. It's interesting here also to see the difference between the VHS tape and the hard drive. So there is a physical reality to all kinds of data. So as I mentioned, autographic means self-writing or self-inscribing in the sense that the vehicle tires inscribe themselves into the snow. And there's a whole family of weather instruments from the late 19th century, early 20th century that were described as autographic instruments. This is, for example, this is an older example, the Campbell-Stokes sunshine recorder. It basically consists of a glass sphere that focuses the sunlight and then burns a trace into this paper that is on the back. And this trace tells us how many hours of the day the sun was shining, because like when it's cloudy, you don't see, you don't get this trace. And then you can put this together over the year and you get very beautiful barcode that more or less tells you the distribution of sunlight throughout the day. So in the 19th century, this was considered very important for public health, because this idea that sunlight basically disinfects and is good for as a remedy for diseases was very important. Yeah, this is a photo I took in Boston at the Blue Hills Observatory. And so you can say these kind of paper strips are data sets, and this is consistent with what historians of science and philosophers, for example, Ian Hacking, how they define data. So data is not always just a digital symbolic data set, but includes a broader range of traces. And for example, if you think about archaeologists, they consider data what they pull out from the ground, whether that is now cataloged or not. And one of my main points is that all forms of data, including digital data, to some extent have these self-inscribing properties. They carry traces of their material origin that is often unrelated to the data content. So climate scientists use what they call climate proxies, such as tree rings, ice cores, ocean or lake sediments, coral layers, and so on. They are an important data source for reconstructing past climates, but in a way they are also data themselves, and they're also visualizations if they are prepared in an appropriate way. And how to treat them as visualizations is this framework that I developed around autographic design. It's grounded in this observation that today's major controversies, whether we talk about climate change, plastic pollution, misinformation, they are not necessarily addressable only through visualizations, because it's the data source that is in question. So like people fight not about the interpretation of a visualization, they fight about whether the data source is truthful. And so autographic design is therefore not a method for visualizing data, but for visualizing the data generation process or the origin of data itself, through which data are generated. And so like I have these kind of 8 design operations to turn a phenomenon into data. Starts with just framing. Framing is a very important process, just to look at a phenomenon in a certain way. Then you need to aggregate traces or separate them. If you have a phenomenon that is not visual, you need to couple it with something, with a tracer substance, for example. And at the end of the day, you want some kind of method to either annotate or encode into quantitative data. So I conceptualized autographic design almost like a mirror image of data visualization. In data visualization, you start with the data, you analyze and interpret it in order to learn something about an external phenomenon. But as I mentioned in my first example, this phenomenon is often quite disconnected because we really live in the world of data here. In autographic design, we start with the phenomenon and look at the data generation process in order to contextualize analysis. So it's kind of like the opposite. And yeah, I think all data, whether analog or digital, share that they carry traces of data generation, and these traces are very often involuntary, unrelated to the data content. This is a technique that I developed with students in Princeton that I call sensor autopsies. The idea here is that every sensor uses some kind of material principle to measure data. There's some kind of autographic principle hidden in a black box. Here we have different ways to measure particulate matter. There's a gravimetric approach where you just collect the dust on a filter and then put it on a scale. There's also a radioactive method where you measure the radioactive absorption and infer how much particulate matter is in the air. And the DIY approach usually uses optical approaches where you can use scattered light to infer the amount of particles. But you notice that those are very different things. On the one hand, we more or less count the number of particles. On the other hand, we look at their weight. So technically speaking, those are different things. But of course, at the end, we always get a number. That number is decontextualized, doesn't really tell us a lot about these kind of intricacies. So the idea of sensor autopsies with the students was to take apart a sensor and figure out how it works and then scale this up into an installation that you can experience this kind of material principle through your senses. And in the case of dust, you can also say that the whole city is a visualization of dust, but you can't really see it. You can only see it once you start cleaning the surfaces. And this was the basis of a project I did in Stuttgart, a city in Germany that has a huge public controversy around dust pollution, where the city and citizen groups disagree about the scale of the problem and about the best way to measure it. And citizens have created this kind of bottom-up sensing initiative where they contest the official measurements of the city. And those kind of discussions, again, quickly go into technical details of measurement, that like what counts as a day with an elevated particulate matter exposure. So what I did is I used this kind of technique, reverse graffiti, to clean out parts of the city to invite this kind of observation. Is there how much dust is there versus what does the sensor say? And then basically let people contemplate and consider that. It's very satisfying to use this kind of pressure washer on all kinds of urban surfaces throughout the city. So it was very interesting. And then, of course, people would say, well, this is not exactly always just particulate matter. There's all kinds of other stuff on these surfaces, which is a flaw of this method, which is, of course, true. But that's exactly the point, that you are able to critique the method because you have access to the material principle by which you measure it, which is something that you don't have if you only get the number from a sensor. There's another similar project, ozone tattoo, which focuses on another common pollutant, in this case ground level ozone, which is somewhat harder to measure for citizen scientists than particulate matter, because ozone is very volatile, and you have calibration issues with your measurement devices, which makes it much more expensive. But interestingly, the US Department of Agriculture has for a long time used plants to measure ozone. So they have a whole range of indicator plants which they describe as a visualization system. This is a tobacco plant, but they have beans and milkweed and all kinds of other plants that are very sensitive to ozone. And usually the way how it works is that they have one type that is very resilient against ozone and another one that is very sensitive. And so then comparing those two allows you to identify and estimate the severity of these episodes of elevated ozone in the environment. And this is usually in the summer when there's a lot of UV radiation, when there's a lot of sunlight, when there's a lot of heat, and then together with emissions from fossil fuels, you get ozone in the atmosphere. And a scientist from NASA, Jack Fishman, used this principle to create ozone gardens, which is like a community-centered approach to monitor ozone pollution, where then the community members, tend to these plants and also, observe the air quality in their neighborhood. And this exists throughout the US, which I found very interesting. But of course, you have to be some kind of expert to really identify and differentiate ozone damage on the leaves from other kinds of damage. So I again used a similar approach where I tried to create this kind of reference pattern, like a legend on a map, on the leaves themselves to make this more legible. And this is something that the people at these national labs didn't do, because they usually would expose the entire plant but not just a part of the leaf. So I had to build this kind of machine for creating ozone tattoos, played around with it in my office during the pandemic. Was not exactly how I wanted it, but it was quite interesting. So, and then I also created this ozone garden. This one is in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Then something happened. I broke my shoulder and I was in the hospital for a couple of months, and it was complicated. So I thought, okay, all the tobacco plants are dead and the project is over. But then I came back and it looked like this. So, which is nice if you usually work with data, suddenly you work with something living. And I was surprised that, the plants have their own agency, they do their own thing. And it's interesting that you actually see that they are on some leaves, you can see some traces of ozone exposure. So they did exactly what they were supposed to do. We also used orthographic approaches in all kinds of different ways. This one is also inspired by the pandemic, where we all, were suddenly so afraid to touch things. And we said, okay, we should not touch surfaces. And through that awareness, we suddenly realize how much we touch all the time when we try to figure out things. So this is something in data visualization and data physicalization. The sense of touch is only considered in relation to people with visual impairments and visualizations for the blind as a replacement of the visual modality, but it's literally never really considered as something that also sighted people are using in combination with the other senses to figure out exactly, to get information from objects. So we created these ambiguous data physicalizations and gave participants different tasks and tried to figure out how do they touch these objects as they try to figure out the solution. And we covered these objects with a kind of an invisible dust layer of a UV tracer substance, which then becomes visible if you put it under UV light, and then you kind of would see these traces of touch, which is very versatile, because doing that either through computer vision or through other sensing approaches is kind of a little bit more complicated and doesn't really work for arbitrary surfaces. And this is a very cheap, but unfortunately very labor-intensive process. So, there's that. So, how is this relevant for digital data? And here my argument is that also digital data is a physical trace of some sort. The only difference between the burned trace of the weather instrument and the bit on a hard drive is that the mechanism in between is a little bit more complicated, but it's very similar. And there are a lot of examples of physical traces in digital space. If you think about a glitch, is a genuinely physical trace in digital space. So if you leave your USB stick with your photos and put it in the washing machine, some of your files might get corrupted, but if you're lucky, you might still be able to open them. And interestingly, the visual patterns from this error of this corruption tells you something about the image encoding. So there's this glitch artist, Rosa Mankman, who systematically investigated what kind of visual artifacts and error patterns you get with different kinds of image formats. And this is also the case for any kind of scientific or large data sets. This is from an animation I did with my partner. Topic was the sky as a navigation device, which is the animation you can see downstairs on the 3 screens. And it consists of multiple parts, but I want to focus on a part of the film where I'm talking about the use of astronomical data. It's a little bit hard to show as it's a 360 video, but here is the cropped version. I don't know if we have. Yeah, there's some kind of sonification going on. But what you see here are bibliographic references from a bibliographic database that collects references to all astronomical objects. So every dot is a reference published in a paper over the last 150 years. And over the years, we see patterns emerge. We see sometimes these regular geometries, these boxes, scan lines, or circles, which correspond to publication practices. When a catalog is published in 1 year, focusing on one part of the sky, the next year there's another part that is published. And so you see these patterns there, but you also see the objects you see the Milky Way, you see, what you would expect to see on a telescope. Here are the most referenced objects. Now it's separating them by different types, stars, galaxies. So you may ask yourself, why does this have to be so ugly? I really tried to reduce the design interventions to a minimum and only use basically 1-bit data, where every reference is just 1 bit of information. Yeah, those are now exoplanets. So we see here, with this particular projection, the Milky Way, which is this curve. We have the center of the galaxy somewhere here. We have the Magellan Clouds. But I want to call attention to this object up here, this kind of strange geometric object. And this is connected to the data collected during the Kepler mission, where they were looking for exoplanets. So it's a space telescope that only looks at this one single spot in the sky over a long period of time, which is important for recording these variations that you need in order to understand exoplanets or to identify exoplanets. And so this is a picture of the space telescope. This is a picture of the image sensor and the feature in the bibliographic database. So, you see that, even these kind of physical struts that maintain the curvature of the image sensor suddenly result in blank spots in the bibliographic record where we don't know whether there are exoplanets there or not. So it's interesting that, this is not a telescope photo, or this is not an image of the sky. It is a bibliographic record that shows the range of inscriptions from the very material basis of the engineering decisions how to build this sensor to our knowledge of what we know about the sky as a very literal kind of trace and imprint here. So this is just to kind of illustrate that this is how broadly I think about traces, because it's all about these kind of material basis of data. I mean, of course, for people working with this data, it's not surprising, but the point here is that there's a lot of hidden information in data that is not necessarily related to the content that you want to capture, but about these kind of material circumstances of collection. And in that sense, I want to introduce a second perspective as an alternative to this representational concept of data. So I'm not saying one is correct or the other one is incorrect, but they are just different lenses or different perspectives. And in this relational concept, data are not treated as a representation or as a reference, but as a description of reality, but as co-constitutive of reality. Like we create reality to some extent in, together with the data. And data here are not describing a phenomenon, but they're actually part of the phenomenon. They are a trace that is generated and that is very strongly connected to the phenomenon in the autographic sense of the physical imprint. Data are also never abstract. They always have a physical body. And so this relational concept is not about the content of data, it's more about the performance, what one can do with data. This also means, how you use data in debates, how you claim it as evidence. There's the fax machine up there. During the pandemic, I think it was in New York, where you suddenly had a flat peak of the cases, which was not because the cases stopped growing, but because there was a bottleneck of the fax machines that was mandated by HIPAA policies to transmit the daily case counts, and the fax machines just couldn't send more than that. So you have this kind of material realities of data infrastructures that more or less interfere. So data is part of a phenomenon, so this relational perspective is also very useful for a second perspective. And I know like everyone at this conference is much more familiar with synthetic data than I am, but as a scholar of critical data studies, I was very surprised when I first encountered synthetic data. So I came across this paper which was about training an AI model to recognize brain tumors. And one of the challenges is that, there are very rare brain tumors. There's not enough data to really train an AI model, also because of the privacy restrictions. So the solution here was to use an AI image generator, I guess like Midjourney or Stable Diffusion, to generate synthetic MRI images of brain tumors and then train an AI model using these synthetic MRI images in order to recognize real brain tumors in real people. So very surprising, but apparently it works. So this is kind of fascinating because it also tells us that when we deal with training, it's a very different situation than when we deal with kind of algorithmic approaches to, let's say, analyzing reality. So synthetic data violates this representational assumption because it doesn't refer to anything in the world. It just tries to look like real data. And when you start thinking about the consequences of working with data that no longer represent anything, it becomes really interesting. Because first of all, you would suspect it shouldn't work. Our common assumption is garbage in, garbage out. An AI model can only be as good as the training data that it gets. And quality usually means representational fidelity, how accurately a data set describes reality or the world. And we also know that biased training data also perpetuates historical inequalities, exclusion, because some people are not well represented in the data. So, but then we also have counterintuitive findings that, for example, injecting noise into the training data set can improve learning and generalization, that in a way worse data can lead to better results. And even including fake or improbable or impossible observations can make models and recognition more robust. So the idea here is, as most of you will know, about maximizing the variability beyond this kind of parameter space of the observations that I have. And this increasing variability means precisely not to make synthetic data as realistic as possible, but to go beyond what the real observations give me. So for me, of course, this raises this question of the epistemic consequences if we have data sets that no longer represent reality. You know, and one of the most immediate consequences is that data quality doesn't depend on reality, but on the performance of the trained model. So it's no longer about what data represent, but how data perform in a particular application area. And from that perspective, the garbage in, garbage out, and these kind of counterintuitive findings share the same concern, which is about bias in data. So the fact that training data is always biased or incomplete is a bigger problem, not just about whether it's realistic or not, because we need the full range of cases to be considered in training. And there's an example of a fully synthetic training data set for facial recognition by Microsoft, which is, doesn't contain any photos of actual persons. It contains these rendered 3D characters. So the interesting thing here is that these 3D characters have randomized age, randomized ethnicity, randomized appearance, hairdos, backgrounds, facial expressions, camera angles, light situations. To avoid these biases, because every portrait that you find on the internet pertains to certain conventions of portrait photography. So you want to avoid these biases. And so the result is this kind of weird body snatcher aesthetics that is slightly unsettling. Another beautiful example along the same line, NVIDIA's Falling Things data set, which is like a glimpse into the hell of household items. Again, random objects with random orientations in randomized backgrounds, which create some delightfully chaotic situations. So synthetic data is, of course, used for many different purposes, and one of them is also protecting privacy, which is a big issue with the Census Bureau, which upsets a lot of social scientists, that they no longer get real microcensus data, but synthetic data. So I was just interested doing an experiment with LLMs, and this was a few years ago, to generate a synthetic microcensus data set. So I basically just prompted to give me a microcensus from a neighborhood in Boston, which is Beacon Hill, and tell me the professions, age, salary, ethnicity of the people of these synthetic residents. And this is actually not easy to get right, because it really requires a nuanced understanding of the socioeconomic environment, of the cultural environment. And of course, LLMs, they don't have a database of the census inside. It's kind of implicit. Beacon Hill is a very rich neighborhood in Boston, and I was not sure whether the LLM would know that. But the people that I got were, you see here, you get architects, directors, business analysts, and so on with high salaries. And then I did the same thing for Roxbury, which is the neighborhood I live in. It's a more working class neighborhood. And here now we get construction workers, custodians, social workers, barbers, and so on. So, I mean, it's surprising that it captured this nuance, but I also felt somehow conflicted about these results, because it's really too much on the nose almost. So I'm a little in this paper that I wrote on in Big Data and Society. I was curious about this kind of issue of Instagram reality of data that looks too good to be true. Which is also like one aspect that I see worth investigating with synthetic data. So synthetic data raises this kind of complicated question about ground truth. And in a literature review that I did recently, I saw 3 different concepts. The first one, which is still very closely connected to this traditional remote sensing understanding of ground truth, which is that ground truth is the best available measure of external reality, like external validity. But now in machine learning, I more and more see a second understanding of ground truth, which is ground truth as whatever the labelers happen to label, whether those labelers are human or automatic. So you just take whatever you have in the data set as ground truth. And this also has an interesting institutional political perspective where now, let's say, a data set that is provided by Google assumes the status of ground truth just because it's provided by a particular institution or by a particular company. But a third thing that I found very interesting is also there is an increasing approach to use conflicting and self-contradicting information as ground truth, where you say, well, I mean, this is self-contradicting, but those contradictions can actually be productive for training because then the model can figure out, can learn about these distinctions and learn to deal with this kind of conflicting statements. So I see a kind of a figure ground reversal when we talk about synthetic data, where the ground truth becomes something more or less self-referential that is defined by the application and not by some kind of external representational notion of reality. So it really becomes about what data does and not what data represents. And so in my last strange animal of data, which I call agentic data, is maybe the most radical one because this challenges this computational assumption, where data is not necessarily useful for its informational content, which we assume is like the whole point of data. But I can give you an example. For example, proof of work blockchain, the basis of the Bitcoin network, as you probably know, involves some extremely intense calculations that as a whole exceeds the electricity consumption of entire countries such as Sweden. So someone who is not familiar with this topic might ask, like what is there to calculate? It's just transactions. I mean, in the 60s, you had like really, small computers who were very good at doing that as well. But of course, the answer is that this is done for security reasons. And the results of these calculations are in themselves, from an informational perspective, absolutely meaningless. I mean, they have no informational value for anything. The whole point of the exercise is to slow down the network on a very material, physical level so that nobody can manipulate it, to burn so much energy that nobody can afford to override it. So this is interesting because now we have a very material purpose of data that is not about the data content, but it is about the material reality of the entire infrastructure that is engaged here. So this is for me the perfect example of agentic data that still serves a very real material economic purpose. And another example is, area that are called info trash, all this AI slop that you find on websites that we visit. Usually the search engines are getting smarter about flagging that, so you get into this hell of AI slop if you click on these associated links at the bottom of every page that takes you to really weird places. And there's all that stuff going on with traffic arbitrage networks where it's really about maximizing the clicks. But the idea here is again the same. You generate all of that information, all of this visual information, textual information, not to inform, but to slow you down, to make you spend more time on a page and basically recuperate some of that money from clicks and from eyeballs. Which, again, is this kind of agentic approach to data, I would say. So, as form of a synthesis between autographic, the synthetic, and the agentic, I'm going to end with a project that we presented at the Venice Biennale of Architecture this year. This week is the last week where it's being shown. So we built a water computer that uses this notion of data in this expanded sense, that uses water ripples as a medium of computation. And there's a long history of water computers going back to antiquity. Those are two examples from the 20th century, the Philips hydraulic computer that simulates the economy. This is like uses an analogy. It's an analog computer that uses the water circulation, the amount of water in relation to money in the economy. And the Soviet example on the right is the water integrators for calculating temperature gradients. Here the analogy is more mathematical. It's about the idea that in concrete the temperature distribution behaves somewhat differently than when I look at how water levels out in these kind of connected tubes. So it's all based on similar differential equations. Right now, there's a lot of interest in analog computers because they use a fraction of the energy necessary for digital computation. In analog computation, you usually have the problem that you need to measure what is being calculated while the result is more or less instantaneous. Whereas in digital computer, you get the result, but the process is much more energy intense to get there. So our project looks at this emerging space of physical reservoir computing, and it's kind of a combination of analog and digital. So in this approach, you use the dynamics of a physical medium, such as water, light, vibration, biological activity in cells, and so on, to transform input data into a high-dimensional space. So you scatter it around in multiple dimensions. For the human observer, at that point, it looks meaningless. It looks like noise. But surprisingly, it becomes very easy to process for a very simple single-layer neural network. So this is the idea of replacing a lot of the layers in a deep learning architecture with a kind of a physical phenomenon with what is called the reservoir, and then only have a single layer readout layer. So what we do, we translate this to the city, where we consider the entire city of Venice and its network of canals as a reservoir in this sense, and look at how the patterns, how water waves propagate through this network, and give us useful signatures for determining the time. And our readout later then classifies them into 6 time periods, very simple. Appropriately for Venice, all of them have something to do with food. It's about time for lunch or aperitivo. And this is based on the situation in the canals. This is how the installation looks like. So we have these kind of 4 water columns, which are roughly equivalent to the nodes in the network, where information is passed around that comes originally from webcams that look at the water surfaces. And then there's a clock that is the thing with these colorful cubes that I showed. So this is like a short video where you can see this. So we use this laser to measure the rippliness of the water surface. Yeah, this is, of course, tourist webcams, which was the only input source that we were able to get for this project. It's not easy to make a physical intervention in the actual historical city of Venice. But this is a model to illustrate that principle. Yeah, and this is basically the readout layer. So every node is associated. The weight is basically turning this cube. Yeah, this is the input data where we look at that. Oh, my hairdo is horrible in this. So it's interesting here that the water ripples are in a way a short-term memory that is used for calculation here. This is like some slides from the setup. So to conclude, I talked about different aspects of data that are non-referential. So how should we talk about data, about the concept of data itself moving forward? There's this idea that the term data means things that are given. So which comes from a legal context, where in a court situation, you bring data. Those are the given things, and then the facts are established based on that. So this idea of the given, of data as the given, has been widely critiqued recently by, in the humanities and in remote sensing as well. And there was this proposal, Joanna Drucker talked about that, to instead of data, we should call it capta, things taken to indicate that data always taken by someone. There's always some interest, there's always some worldview, there's always some bias, there's always some ideology behind any measurement or data collection approach. But both capta and data are still more or less passive. You know, the objects are the result of that activity. So we could also think about acta, things done, you know, where we acknowledge this kind of more material agency of data that was more or less, hopefully, clear in all of these examples that I've given. There's also a historical root that was, you know, acta was used in the Roman times already to, you know, document these official proceedings. But I want to end here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, so we won't have time for questions, but I want to thank our speaker again for his interesting thoughts on the intersection of data, art, and the physical world. And I think it all provided us some insightful things to think about. And the last thing I did want to mention was that the invited program will continue here at 1:30, and we'll return to the topic of how do we get enough power for data centers and our nuclear reactors in our future. But thank you. Thank you to our speaker.
Thank you. I'll be happy to answer questions if anyone wants to catch me. Thank you.